Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to see that so many of you have found the way to NUPI this morning, a dark and rainy December morning. Welcome also to our online audience. As usual, this seminar will be streamed online. My name is Helge Blokkesrud, and I'm the head of the research group on Russia, Asia, and international trade here at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and have the pleasure to chair this seminar, Putin's Russia, Vanguard or Rearguard of Populism. After 2012, and especially after 2014, we got a steady stream of reports about how the Kremlin was reaching out to and supporting right-wing populist parties and movements across Europe. The rationale was partly said to be based on shared values, on a shared agenda of anti-globalism and vaguely defined traditional values. Partly, and especially after the onset of the sanctions regime in 2014, it was seen as an attempt to split a united front of Europe through backing anti-establishment parties. But was Putin's Russia the first to embrace populism, or will Moscow see a populist uprising of its own? This is the question Maxim Trudolyubov will address here in his presentation on Putin's Russia as the vanguard or rearguard of populism. Many of you would know Maxim from before. Some of you attended the Free Word Foundation's Russia conference last Thursday, where Maxim was presenting, and others of you would of course have read some of his publications, but briefly, Max is an editor of, at large of the Russian business newspaper Vedomosti. He's a senior fellow at the Kennan Institute in Washington, D.C., an opinion writer for the New York Times, and he has recently published the book, The Tragedy of Property, Private Life and Ownership in the Russian State. And Max will speak for some 35-40 minutes so that we will have ample time for a Q&A session afterwards. And we'll go on for approximately 1.5 hours. So without further ado, Max, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'll try and be sort of brief and to the point. Okay, how it works. Okay, good. So the idea is to try and put what's been happening in Russia in some context and to see it the way to compare the way we see what's been happening in Russia to how Russia is seen from the outside world, especially Europe. So there is this constant angst and anxiety and fear about the so-called populist wave, or whatever we call it, and whenever, it's like especially last year or probably the year before, whenever you would have somebody writing about it, like in numerous cases, you would have Russia on top of the list, and Putin would be seen as some kind of mentor to all those brave new populist leaders who are challenging the established order and getting rid of the old party systems, the centrists. It became a cliche, and everybody would just mention Putin there as if he really was part of it. Although, I mean, come to think about it, he's been around for quite a long time. And just maybe, who knows? But maybe these are just events that been rather in parallel rather than really influenced by each other. Whether the link between these things is really causal is a question. Yes, there is a correlation. Is there a causality? Putin's been doing something very specific in Russia since the early 2000s, or actually his line of politics started even before him, during the late Yeltsin period. But basically what Putin has been doing, he's been establishing control over the kinds of institutions that he saw as challenging his power. And he started with media, and he put all the important media under control, starting with television. And he worked with the businesses and put all the major businesses and the large companies all under the state control in different ways, but by now these are all departments of the Russian state rather than real private companies. He changed the politics of memory, which is kind of really important for him also very early in his first term. He started to change it, getting from the kind of controversial and discussion that Russia used to have during the previous 15 years to basically establishing a new model, a kind of glorifying the past rather than arguing about the past, rather than remembering the past. And yes, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church would become an important part of his political regime. And then, of course, when you look at political leaders like Viktor Orban, who would, for the second time, win the prime ministerial post in Hungary in 2010, he would hardly have anyone to look at that time. Putin would make a great mentor, a great teacher in all of the above, right? You know, what to do with the media, what to do with your memory politics, what to do with the church, etc., etc. And we see that these are roughly the guidelines that Orban used. Again, we don't know the causality, but we do see a clear pattern here, and yet, yeah, and Putin learned some of the tricks from somebody. And I would just like to mention, I'm no expert on Italy, but it's a well-known fact that Vladimir Putin and Silvio Berlusconi, by now kind of almost a forgotten figure in our days, when everything, like, we forget things like the day after. But Berlusconi was a very kind of a larger-than-life presence in his day, which was not that long ago, actually. But he was around during the 90s, and they became almost friends. Everybody says that. And Berlusconi, again, there are very few ways of establishing these things, but this is what people say, let's say, in Moscow and around Moscow, that Berlusconi was a great teacher in terms of telling Putin what to do with the media and PR and how to behave. Berlusconi used to be his career started as a kind of as an entertainer. He would entertain people on boats and sing, and he would always be jokes, kind of a play this kind of a simple guy, never an intellectual, very often an awkward gaffe, that he would love that, to say things about, I don't know, Angela Merkel, and then like the next day everyone is like all the newspapers, all television is like discussing what his behavior, like a bad boy, like, you know, a schoolboy who's always attracting attention. And so Putin must have learned a lot from him in that sense, because this is what Putin does domestically, especially domestically in Russia. He's been doing this for 20 years now. But of course, I would argue that Putin's greatest teacher is Russian history, in fact. Berlusconi is like really superficial. It's like some of the tricks, some of the media tricks, also probably some financial tricks, with using European banks for stashing cash, things like that. But fundamentally, Putin is part of Russia's history rather than anything else. And this brings us to the kind of long DeRay issues here. What Putin is doing is not, in fact, dictated by the past, like the immediate past, although it is in a large part. But fundamentally, he's been learning from other Russia's leaders, and the situation in which most Russian leaders, over the long stretches of time, have found themselves would be fundamentally this: that you have a very large country that is lagging behind economically, but has a very strong aspirations about its role in history and in the world. And you would always have this gap between Russia's perceived mission, Russia's ambition, and Russia's ability, especially economic ability, and military and economic ability. And this has almost always been the case, this gap. And most Russian leaders would find themselves in a position where they would have to somehow bridge this gap, to do something, to overtake, at least to catch up with other big nations, because they would always see Russia as a big nation, but they would lack the resources to kind of prove it. And that's why you would always try and punch above your weight as a Russian leader. And over the centuries, Russian leaders would invent all kinds of ways of doing it. During the past 20 years, the way Putin, and especially the past almost 10 years, or actually 10 years as we start with Georgian war, Putin was punching above his weight through engaging in conflict of various kinds. And one very good example is this recent episode in the Kerch Strait, where the situation essentially, I won't talk about it, it's just very briefly to give you an example, a recent example, is that in this case, it's a strait between Crimea and Russia proper. And Crimea, of course, officially, the international law has it that Crimea is Ukrainian, but Russia has it that Crimea is Russian. And for Russia, it's a fact on the ground. For the rest of the world, it's not. So it's a de facto, Russia wants to maintain a de facto reality, which does not play well with the de jure situation. And this is just one recent example, that Russia creates a geopolitical reality and then tries to bring it, kind of get it fixed and recognized by everyone else. And this case is just a little example of how it's been happening for years, and just, you know, for the past 10 years it would include parts of Georgia that are like this. parts of other countries, post-Soviet countries, like Transnistria and parts of Ukraine, that Russia presents as one thing and the rest of the world sees it something else. And so Russia is constantly playing with these two realities, de facto and de jure. But the irony of the situation right now is that vis-a-vis Russia, Ukraine now is in this position. So Ukraine is actually able to play the same game Russia used to play for a long time vis-a-vis the West. So Russia, the weak, would play this game and punch above its own weight, never have lots of resources, but have enough resources to provoke and to dare. And this time Ukraine can do the same, and kind of in a reduced scale, but still in a conflict between these two nations. Ukraine is the weaker player, but it has enough resources to dare Russia. So basically, Putin is now faced with his own tools, his own instruments played against him. And the context here is that that Russia is changing. The political system that Vladimir Putin has built has been around for a long time now. And recently, just recently, this year, after triumphant re-election, which was not really re-election, but kind of almost a re-election in the sense that the electoral practices could be questioned, but yes, Putin is a popular leader, and he would probably have won even a free and fair election still. Anyway, but after this triumphant return to office in May officially, he faced a chain of crises that wouldn't seem to stop. The spy scandals, all those stories with the Russian agents caught red-handed in attempts to breach, even breach Wi-Fi in places like The Hague, which was like, which was really funny. Like all the 3 or 4 Russian men were caught trying to hack into the headquarters of the chemical weapons control organization in The Hague. So it was a bit childish and kind of weird. But anyway, so we had, and of course this Skripal affair, the attempted murder of the former spy Sergei Skripal in Salisbury in England. So all this was kind of embarrassing. But there was not all, of course, because there were these failed regional elections in September and church crisis. It's a long story, but basically it's about the Russian church who had a historic control over the Ukrainian church. But then the Ukrainian church has challenged that and is likely to get an independent church of its own soon, with the center in Kiev. And Putin's famous approval ratings are sliding for a long, long time, and everybody's been asking these questions, especially foreign journalists been asking us, how come Vladimir Putin seems to be immune to anything, and he would always enjoy an 80+% approval rate in Russia, no matter what. And after this past summer, that's changed, mainly due to some domestic reforms, especially the pension system reform and the increase of the age of retirement in Russia. But it's actually more than that. It's more complex. But anyway, so you have a chain of crises none of which in particular is dangerous, but they're just happening one after another and create a certain pressure. And of course, this recent summits, unsummits, I don't know how to call it, with Trump, because they seem to, the Kremlin seems to insist all the time that they need a summit with Trump, but then they won't get it. And it's kind of becoming really comical in the end, because no one really, I mean, when you even talk to people in Moscow, or the experts and people close to the Kremlin, no one really understands what is it exactly for that the Kremlin wants a summit so much, because they don't really have a long agenda, and most people say that it's just a matter of status. So it's a kind of a historic attitude that remained almost since the Soviet times, that meeting a US president kind of gives you an aura of a world leader, like the top rank. But I mean, in today's world, with all the changes that have been happening in the US itself, all these things that are becoming a little questionable. But anyway, so continuously Russia kind of wants this. So I mean, I would say that Kim Jong-un from North Korea would have his reasons to meet Trump. For him, that definitely is a great breakthrough. For Moscow, I don't know. But anyway, so Putin wanted the summit, and in the end, he got rejected through a tweet, which is, you don't imagine to what extent this is embarrassing. This is, I mean, for the Kremlin, this is incredible. And I think the Kremlin will respond, I'm sure, with time. Yeah, and the funny thing, of course, I'm no expert on American comedy shows, but sometimes I do watch them. And strangely, I have not heard Putin being mentioned as Trump's teacher anymore. It used to be a lot of it. There used to be like constantly, the shirtless Putin would always be somewhere there. And nowadays I see that Trump is always seen as a populist in his own right. Now he is himself sort of a mentor to I don't know, at least to somebody like Bolsonaro in Brazil. And again, this is kind of a speculation, but Putin's been consistently called for years and years in various shapes and forms the most powerful politician, the most powerful man, as Fareed Zakaria called him, in the world. And it's kind of unlikely. I don't think that this would be possible now, with all those crises, behind his shoulders, and the kind of new situation. So basically, it's not that Putin himself is changing; he is not, but the background against which Putin is seen is changing very drastically and fast. So he's just fading. So my sense is that Russia being, I mean, even if we use the terms, which is like a big if, but still, if we use these international relations kinds of terms, the revisionist status quo, we would see, our sense at least in Russia is that Russia's international stance is slowly drifting from highly revisionist to neutral and almost status quo seeking stance, which is a controversial thing to say, but this is how it feels, mostly because they are getting old, and they don't seem to be getting any any younger people in within the top ranks, not the gubernatorial or MPs, but the actual people who run Russia, who run the show in the country. They're not getting any younger, and they're many of them are in their 60s or late 60s, approaching 70, which is, by Russian standards, whose leadership used to be rather young, actually, 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. Right now, it's kind of approaching your Western standard, more or less. I mean, so even approaching the American situation, where you have, which is like really interesting, where you have people in their 70s competing for political prizes, which is great because it means that we all live longer and you know, longer careers. Fine, but I think that there's a certain maturity that comes with age, and Putin definitely has reached a certain maturity in his own way. So this is why we kind of, the sense that we have in Russia is that the Kremlin does not no longer is interested in you know, in these the kinds of adventures it used to engage. And yes, the important part of it is that slowly but steadily, for the past 20 years, the Russian state has been expanding domestically. By now, Russia's economy is essentially, you really need some kind of new terms to define it, because it's not really a capitalist system. It's, well, state capitalism or some kind of state capitalism, but the figures we have, and they're all questionable. Roughly 75% of Russia's economy is controlled by the state, but in fact it's probably even more than that, because many private companies, especially large private companies, even if they are private, they are essentially directed in their most important decisions, including investment decisions. They are directed by the state, and you hardly can call this full ownership. It's some kind of combination, and the bigger the state, the less governable, and it's almost like an iron law. And it has been an iron law, definitely, in Russia's own history. We've had so much of this. It's amazing that the current Kremlin rulers are going back there in this same direction, because the Soviet Union collapsed essentially because it became ungovernable, and it was just too cumbersome and ran out of cash. And so and now with Russia still being dependent, and probably arguably even more dependent on its oil and gas revenue, you have a precarious situation with running a state like this. So it's hard to be as kind of an agile revisionist power with this kind of, you know, carrying this kind of luggage. Yeah, well, and this is just to say that essentially it's been a lot of talk that Putin has been supporting right-wing populist forces in Europe. But I would just say that the way this support has been realized is not really a support. There were stories of some loans to France's Marine Le Pen. Yes, but that's long ago, and the bank that gave these loans is defunct, and essentially Russia would almost never really pay for anything. It is just rhetoric. There was this story with the Greece. If anyone remembers, things changed so fast. But the Greece of a few years before with the debt crisis, and the then leader Alexis Tsipras would go to Moscow and St. Petersburg and meet with Putin and make the front pages, but Moscow, and essentially the understanding was that Putin would help him out of Greece's debts, but this never happened. And just recently, in a similar way, Italy's populist leaders were thinking that Moscow would help them, would provide at least some financial resources to help them play the game with the European Union. But this didn't materialize either. And this is almost always ends with disappointment. The relationships with the right-wing populists come to Moscow and think that they would get, essentially, what do you want? You don't want rhetoric. You want, or not just rhetoric. You want funding, and Moscow is very stingy. Just won't give you anything. Just try to play rhetoric. And essentially play it cheap, and try to get something out of Europeans. Just scare them, probably. But it's all essentially PR. It boils down to very little. So essentially, by now, I mean, if you look at Hungary. With all the smiles, Orban is still meeting with Putin all the time, of course. But Hungary expelled a Russian diplomat after the Skripal. Hungary promised to increase its military spending to please Trump, not to please Putin, of course, because Hungary is part of NATO, of course, and the rest of it. So you have European politicians now trying to please Trump rather than think about Putin and trying to do with what to do with Putin. Yeah, and this was funny. The fourth Trump, I don't know where it went, but Andrzej Duda of Poland went to Washington and was asking. He essentially offered to pay for the military base and call it Fort Trump, which is like a really, it's kind of, if you come to think of it, a reversal of things of old, where you would have the U.S. pay for military bases, and then you have protests in these countries during the Soviet times and post-Soviet times, and now essentially you have Polish leaders saying, we will build a military base and we will call it Fort Trump. Just give us the name, not even the money. So the system is old, and my question to myself is whether, how and to what extent it is threatened. What are the challenges to Putin's system, which has been, again, around for 20 years, and within the Russian context, it really is an old system by now. Brezhnev has been around for 18 years. I mean, I remember that time. I went to school. I was, I think, entering school when Brezhnev died. And actually, it's kind of almost a recent memory. I remember it well. And I remember my parents, and kind of, everyone was talking that Brezhnev was around for a long time, like endless Brezhnev. And it was just 18 years. Putin is already has been around for longer than that. And in Russian history, certainly in the 20th century, the longest rule is Stalin's, and it's roughly 25 years. Because, I mean, he's officially has been longer than that, but basically his rule proper is roughly 25 years, between the late 20s and 1953 when he died. So Putin, when his term finishes, this term he's serving right now, will have been in power for 25 years exactly. So the question is whether, of course, he will try and continue. But we already know that his rule is one of the longest. Well, basically, will probably be the longest for the during the past century, and will approach some of the longer terms that some Russian czars had in the past. We had longer ruling czars, that's for sure. But the past century, he's looking to be kind of one of the longest ruling leaders. And the interesting thing about populism in Russia is that the Kremlin rulers have been very smart about it for a long, long time. And the kind of populism that you would, like kind of a normal populism, give us more money, justice, kind of extreme left, extreme right populism in Russia has been historically for the past 25, almost 30 years, even before Putin, under the umbrella of the state. The administration, we have the presidential administration in Russia is the country's most powerful political organization structure that essentially is ruling its political, sort of presiding over Russia's political decisions, especially domestic ones. And the kind of the usual suspects, the usual populists are all within the system. Russia has these kind of an array of political parties that are controlled through the presidential administration, and they include the so-called Liberal Democratic Party, which is kind of comically named. It has nothing to do neither with liberalism or democracy, but it's kind of the populist thing that, and it's been around for at least 25 years. And they essentially, it's a kind of a pocket opposition. And the same with communists, and the same with smaller parties that exist, lots of them, but they're all essentially are spoilers to take part in elections and show the diversity, competition. So it's unlikely that the Putin system will be challenged by the kind of normal populism, because the Kremlin knows about it in advance and tries to control it. The only political force that is visible in today's Russia and is not associated with the Russian political system is Alexei Navalny's movement. And it's basically the only challenger, but it's too weak. It's a special, we could discuss it if anyone has any questions, but it's still the way the system works. It's unlikely that this political force can make its way up through the current institutions, because the current institutions are designed specifically to prevent uncontrolled movements like this to get to power in any shape or form. And but there are other forces in Russia, and they're more chaotic, but they, I think, actually represent the real challenge, and they are what the current Kremlin is actually facing. Basically, what I think is interesting, and this is something I've been always thinking about when trying to understand what's going on is that the most important part of Russia is the one I'm actually wrapping up. Is the one that we don't see. It's what's invisible that's interesting, I think. And what's invisible is that at least half of Russia's workforce, Russia roughly has 70 plus million people working. And almost half of them exist outside of the institutions of the state. They don't pay taxes, or they partly don't pay taxes, or they exist completely outside of the realm of the state. It's cash, it's natural exchange, it's all kinds of things, but it's completely invisible. The only way you can register it is use the usual ways you use, to measure shadow economy. Measure the electricity, the movements of people, anything that you can physically, put your hands on, and then try and figure out because the official statistics, the state doesn't see it, and it's huge. And we have lots of property that's not registered, and it doesn't exist on paper. Or we have we even have electricity power lines that nobody owns and nobody knows why they still work and why they exist, like in smaller towns in Russia. I mean, I'm not making this up. And, just people, there is electricity in people's homes and they live and they're fine, but there's no bill coming in. And everybody's fine with that, of course. I mean, especially those who use the electricity. And roads and timber, for example, that's illegally cut and sold. There's lots of stories like that, and then they're really hard to pinpoint and measure because of their nature of being not fully observable. It's interesting that Russia's population, in fact, the way people think about themselves, they really think about themselves as self-reliant. Polls, public opinion polls, consistently show two things: that people are very sure that they cannot influence any decisions that the Russian state makes, and it's like 80% plus always throughout years, and then very high numbers, especially recently. This study by the sociologist Sergei Belanovsky, the study that shows that incredibly more than 90% of those polled say that they're completely self-reliant. They don't expect any help, no social support whatsoever. They don't even. So basically, when we talk about the pension reform and the retirement age, people don't think about it in really as a social support they rely on. They think about it as some form of justice. They just think that we work, we invest our effort and time very often outside the state. But this, but we don't protest. We see all the things that you're doing. You at the top in Moscow, and we don't bother you. So let's just have little something in return. Why don't you And this is like really this is meager. This is like tiny. The pensions are not really large, so it's more symbolic. It's like it's a little something for our elderly mother, elderly father to help us support him, because in most families the support for the older generation comes from the younger generation. It's the fact of life. So yes, so this is the kind of non-populist, popular movement that is disorganized, non-organized, that I think is the Kremlin's main alternative, challenger, and a problem that the Kremlin will be facing into the future. And I will conclude at this point, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to respond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Max, and sorry to rush you towards the end here, but because I think it's a very important point you raise here. We too often talk about the all-powerful, all-controlling Kremlin, but there is a lot going out there that is beyond the Kremlin's reach. But before we open up the floor, I would just return to what you said about the Kremlin turning into a status quo seeker. I can see that in the domestic agenda, where they have very little new to offer. It's more about maintaining stability and continue as is. But what about in international relations? Would you also say that the Kremlin is turning into more of a status quo seeker there? Or is it, are you reserving this for the domestic arena?
No, internationally too, I think. I mean, you see, of course, technically speaking and legally speaking, Moscow is still the biggest challenger, probably. Well, of course, Moscow violated international law and annexed Crimea. Moscow has been waging war in Ukraine. But right now, the mood in the Kremlin seems to be that we just, the idea is to fix these gains. Of course, they won't be thinking at this point in time in giving up anything. But, fixing, controlling whatever's gained is the priority. And in this sense, Moscow is a status quo player, but also in all the other avenues. If you look at the Iran deal, for example, Moscow definitely is with Europe and with China on the Iran deal. Keep the Iran deal. Moscow is with Europe and the rest of the world on the world trade. Keep the world trade rules the way they are, again, as opposed to Washington. So Washington's challenged the Iran deal, challenged WTO arrangement. The climate deal, Washington has challenged, and essentially Trump has taken the US out of the Paris Accord. And Moscow is supporting all of the above. So on many of those, and these are not, it's just the surface. There are lots of other issues on which Moscow would be, a rather reliable partner. Nuclear proliferation, by the way. So in these cases, Moscow is conservative. And, the big question, to what extent reliable, but is definitely a conservative partner of the West. And in these issues, it is a status quo power.
Okay, we'll open up the floor, and since we have an online audience as well, we would need to use a mic. So, and please introduce yourself. First question is here.
Julie Wilhelmsen, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much. That was great. And I'm going to use the opportunity to ask you to solve a problem for me, and I think several of us in this room. Because those of us who've been watching Russia for a long time, we know that the Putin leadership is possible of playing very bad tricks. So all these happenings, which are in fact extremely crucial, I think, in Russia-Western relations, such as the Skripal murders or this Kerch incident. It's not unbelievable for us that they could be a setup of, by Putin somehow. At the same time, some of them just don't seem rational. I mean, what was there to gain by the Skripal murders? But then we are in a Western setting where increasingly anything that happens is just immediately pinned on Putin. Or, like the Kerch Strait incident is just, oh yes, another example of Russian hybrid warfare. So that kind of, as pundits, that kind of scares us, because we don't want to accept these happenings at face value as Putin's tricks, although they could be. So my problem is, which sources do you look for when the next thing happens? Which sources do you use to distinguish what actually happened here, and who was it? Was it Putin this time, or was it not?
Well, it's a good question, but you see, let's. I think we have to look at different things differently, in a sense. If you look at the spy scandals. An attempted murder. You cannot really imagine that Russian military spy agency would go rogue and do it all by itself without Putin knowing about it. I have zero doubts. It's been a special operation directed from the very top. Probably not in all of its details as the usual. I mean, experts know it better. But and in a general sense, there's a chain of command. GRU, the so-called GRU, GRU, the military kind of spy agency, which is actually called differently. It's complicated. Anyways, the brand, the international brand, is GRU. So it's a military. The people are wearing epaulets. All those people who were, including those who were caught in the Netherlands and, by the way, in Montenegro too, an attempted coup in Montenegro 2 years ago. They are military people. It's highly unlikely that they would just go on vacation and try and killing someone. So it was some kind of botched operation essentially. And all the questions, why it happened. So I mean, we don't have all the answers actually, even in Russia domestically, because it doesn't look, the Kremlin doesn't look very much. The Kremlin doesn't benefit from it clearly. Although there are people in Russia who say that Kremlin does benefit, but I don't really buy it. I don't think. I think it just didn't work. Something went wrong. But in other cases are more complicated. So with spies, I think it's pretty straightforward. But other things are complicated. You see, the Ukrainian episode, the Kerch Strait, is complicated because, precisely because of this de facto reality and de jure reality. And they kind of overlap. And Russia wants to prove to the rest of the world, especially to Ukraine, that the de facto reality is the actual reality. So that Russia created certain facts on the ground, annexed Crimea, and now has a territory around Crimea which it considers its own. But Ukraine doesn't buy it, of course, because and the rest of the world follows the international legislation. But Russia wants to prove that essentially it can act as if this was, and that's why Ukraine can manipulate that. Ukraine can just go through the strait change the procedure slightly because there is a technical procedure there. Apparently, these Ukrainian ships didn't do something the way they would do it before, and so they slightly provoked the Russian side, as I understand it, and then the Russians overreacted. Something happened, but basically the Ukrainians are in the right. They're legally right. Russians consider themselves right, kind of in practical terms. And that's what happens. And so basically now that not just Putin but somebody else, in this case Ukrainian politicians, can provoke him. So in this particular case, it's not, I think, Putin who's pulling the strings in this case and similar cases. It's where Putin's previous decisions are coming to haunt him. He created a certain situation, and then it backfires. And this was, I think, an example of how it can backfire. So there are different. Unfortunately, there's no good overall answer. But I think that one should look at events and news and see and ask questions like, if it's something that would normally be controlled by the state, like a military chain of command, it's likely that's the case. But then, if it's a complicated story like this with Ukraine, it's very often it may be some other force involved, and then the situation, the precarious situation, that completely that exists completely outside of the realm of the law that Putin has created, backfires and haunts him.
Odd Gunnar?
Thank you. My name is Odd Gunnar Skagestad. I'm an old-age pensioner, having studied Russian affairs for about 2/3 of a century. Lived 7 years of my life in the Soviet Union and in Russia, and recently written a book about the Russian political developments from Lenin to Putin. I met Putin personally, by the way. Now, I'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Trudolyubov, for dispelling and discarding the idea very effectively that Putin's Russia is a populist regime. Quite to the contrary. I mean, domestically, it's diametrically opposite of any populist regime, if there are such a thing as populist regimes. Populism is by its very nature anti-establishment and anti-regime. And internationally, Putin's Russia, they play with the rhetorical part of it, but that is a part of the divide and conquer strategy. But I've got one question for you, and that concerns the definition of Russia's economy. And you mentioned that the Russian state nowadays actually controls 75% of Russia's economy, and in fact even more probably. And you also said that we need to find a new word to define this kind of economy. So my question to you is, would the term kleptocracy fit your bill? Thank you.
Yeah, it's well, you see, you could do that. You could do that. But I think it wouldn't cover the whole thing, because it was just, it would only capture the negative part of it, because there's a lot, yes, of course, there's a lot of corruption, and it's not even corruption, it's essentially stealing assets, money, and it's been certainly throughout Putin's years in much larger scale than under Yeltsin, by the way. But it's just part of it, because, you know, you cannot run a country by just being a corrupt politician. You need a positive program, and you need actually to run it. So it's kind of a combination of things. And for me, in my view, today's Russia has a lot of common features with the Russia of the past, the kind of pre-revolutionary Russia, almost of 15th, 16th century time, when you would have a very powerful Tsar who would be responsible, among other things, for distributing property and managing a kind of property affairs between its most important servants, who would technically own large estates, but who would be very much dependent on the Tsar and would never fully be able to dispose of these things, to use them the way a completely total ownership system would mean. So in this case, it's a system that has a very strong center that presumably purports to control everything, but simply because you cannot physically control everything, it's just lacking. And you see a system that pretends to manage everything, but doesn't really. So basically, what they manage is that they manage the largest companies and the most important oligarchs and the biggest industries. Probably they do manage, but the rest of it is kind of goes all by itself, and it's basically very chaotic. And also the important part of it is that Russia's regions are incredibly diverse in terms of incomes and their economic systems and lifestyles and everything. And the diversity is enormous. It's like almost like an it's probably, by some counts, it's more drastic than in places like India or Brazil, because you have very rich, almost basically post-industrial parts of Russia, like Moscow, St. Petersburg, but then you have essentially almost pre-industrial parts of Russia in the south and the Caucasus and some other republics, the Altai region. And the incomes, the diversity, the difference, the income gap between regions would reach 20-25 times between the top and the rest of it. So it's hard to define this system really. Its appearance is state capitalism. I think this is what they call it, and politically it's a very typical authoritarian regime, and most political scientists call it that. But it's kind of not fully in control. It's a system that very often appears one thing and is something else.
Like semi-feudal, for example.
Could be, yeah, could be. And also, just to conclude, that if you are in Moscow, again, the diversity. If you are in Moscow, you would be forgiven to think that this is one of the prosperous and rich and free parts of the world. Like, I mean, in Moscow, you would see all those cafes and vibrant social life and very popular lecture tours and I don't know, bookshops, theater, cinema, all of that. Hardly different from what you have in Berlin, let's say, with some little ideological differences. Probably there are certain things you can hardly do, but they're a very short list. So basically, you wouldn't think of it as a highly authoritarian regime, and yet it is actually.
There is a lot of Russia beyond Moscow. But yeah. I would like to come back to something you were speaking about last Thursday at the Free Word Foundation Russia conference, about the disconnect between the Kremlin, between Putin and the people. We had this rallying around the flag, or rallying around the president effect after Crimea, and you talked about how it had now waned, or it's no longer there. It's a disconnect between the rulers and the ruled. And here you spoke about the Kremlin as a status quo seeker. But then again, we have seen Putin reinvent himself several times over.
Mm-hmm.
is he able to pull it off again? Will he be able to reconnect with the population?
Well, you see, the Kremlin already saw a situation like it's facing now. Let's say in 2013, probably, when Putin's ratings were sliding and the oil prices were going down. By the way, which is also happening right now, from a high top, but still, it's for Russia. All of it is very important. So and the usual reaction, the usual thing the Kremlin would do is to go on some kind of adventure. And 2013 went into 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and then intervention in Ukraine. I don't see anything of the kind happening. There was a lot of talk, by the way, in Russia recently, when all this chain of, unfortunate events of the summer and autumn in Russia, that people would say, political commentators in Russia would say that what's next? Is it Belarus? Because Belarus remains, it's kind of, it has a very peculiar status. It's part of essentially a non-existent two-country state between Russia and Belarus, but still it enjoys some independence. So people would think, is Putin going to officially kind of include Belarus in Russia, and that would constitute some kind of, a foreign policy act that would energize his political base, and everybody would be happy again. But it doesn't seem likely. People are tired. People don't seem to be very interested in watching Ukraine bashing, because basically Russian television is constant Ukraine bashing, like every day. Ukraine is this, Ukraine is that, and the U.S. But you get tired, and people are no longer interested, and so it doesn't seem likely. But again, Putin is famous for being unpredictable, so I would not exclude an adventure of some kind. But again, he's getting older and he's getting tired, so that's why it feels like this now, that he is more interested in keeping whatever he has rather than trying to gain more.
Okay, then we have a question over there.
Thank you. My name is Olga Abelova. I'm with MP, a human rights NGO. And I also had a question about how you're sort of unpacking this populism of Putin. Like the question that was already asked noted that it can be difficult to see Putin as a populist because his policies are largely pushing the interests of the ruling elite. But at the same time, he does remain very popular, and a lot of the movements that have come up against him often get labeled as elitist. So I'm curious about your perspective of more the domestic policies. What have been the domestic policies that have accounted for his popularity, and how is that faring now?
Sure. I mean, after a series of unfortunate events in 2013, he launched into this annexation, and this energized his support. And in fact, nobody expected the kind of effect back then. It was more than 90% of the population who supported that move. My theory about it is based on some kind of guesses, but they are probably informed guesses, but still there is a lot of mystery about it to me to this day. But I think that it was some kind of event that reminded people that they could be part of a great power, of something that is great. And they loved it, because in their real lives, they don't really see much of the state, much of the power, much of social, definitely not social support of any kind, or education, or medical health, health services. They always rely on themselves, and suddenly there is something, some big story, a narrative that many people can connect to, and they loved it out of pure enthusiasm, just symbolic. It was a completely symbolic event for 99% of Russians, who most of them would never travel to Crimea and have nothing to do with Crimea. So apparently it was something like this, which is, again, strange and half unexplained. But I think I would go into this direction rather than anything else, because the Russian state, again, cannot really provide the goods to the population. It can give some goods, but clearly not enough, and increasingly less and less. Again, with the oil prices going down, with the economy being stagnant, no sources of growth seen whatsoever. No economist in Russia predicts growth more than 2%, and this is like really 2% a year annual GDP growth. And this is like really, really optimistic. So essentially, people expect it hover a little bit above zero, if at all. And this doesn't mean that people can plan big things in their lives. What they do, I mean, go and borrow more money. Yes, that's what they do. Or exist outside of the state and continue to support their little dacha that doesn't exist on paper, just is basically a fact of life. So these are the kinds of things people are doing, and the Crimea was something that gave them the sense of being Russian, some kind of, proud to be Russian, which people apparently want. People want to be proud Norwegians, proud Swedes, proud everyone. And Russians, of course, is given the country's history, and also the kind of always ambition, and always feeling special, always wanting to be special. That was the moment everyone thought, wow, finally, we are back. But then, now, 4 years after, it doesn't seem like we are back, and people are disappointed again.
We have a couple more questions on my list. First out is Karsten.
Hello, thank you. My name is Karsten Friis. I work here at NUPI. Lots of analysts tend to point to when it comes to security and defense policy of Russia, that it's it's a kind of useful in a way to have a confrontation with the West, because it kind of gives Russia a certain identity. You can divert attention from what you just talked about, domestic needs and things like that. First of all, I don't know if you subscribe to that kind of analysis, but follow on that, there's a concern, especially growing in Europe these days, about INF Treaty and all the rest of it. It's kind of post-Cold War and Cold War agreements, Vienna documents and things like that. It seems to be falling apart. So my question is, if lots of people are asking, do we have a common ground? Can we agree on something when it comes to security and defense with Russia? Are there things we can agree upon? Or is that not desirable, so to speak, from the Russian point of view?
Yeah, it's a very Western question, which I totally understand. I mean, if you're rational, you want your counterpart to be rational too. The thing is that the Kremlin apparently has some kind of different rationality, I would say. Yeah, yes, of course, very often, for years, including during the Soviet period, the Kremlin would use international events for domestic purposes. Of course, I wouldn't say that it would be always all of the game, but definitely a lot of the media game. And Russia's current regime is has a huge media part of it. It is essentially a PR, a kind of almost virtual. A lot of it exists on television, and that again provides for the Russian population a sense of being part of something big and large. Yeah, so this is rational. I mean, to what extent this is the rational from the Western point of view? Well, is a question, right? This is something Putin learned from Berlusconi, I guess, right? You own all the TV channels and you run them the way you want. But I think that in many of the international stories, the Kremlin does want to be also rational in a kind of Western sense. Try to play. Well, the Iran deal is a good example. When the interests could be aligned the way they were in the run-up to the Iran deal, then it's fine, then it works. Apparently, well, hopefully, it could be, the Kremlin could be talked to, negotiated with, and dealt with on a rational basis. Of course, I very much understand the problems, in the sense that very often Moscow feels threatened and see a threat somewhere the West doesn't see it. And Moscow, to prevent this threat or to counteract, does something Moscow thinks is purely rational, like defensive. And then the West like says, wow. And there's complete disconnect. This I understand. How to overcome this, I at this point, I don't know. But really the best thing one can say is that clearly, probably, let's say, if you include, in talking to Russia, if you include more of the de facto reality, at least discussing it, not just dismissing it out of hand, saying like, Crimea is not on the table, like forget about it. I'm sure that the West, if it exists, by the way, it's also a big question, but Russia's counterparts outside of Russia, if they want to discuss things with Russia, at least probably recognize Russia's kind of tortured sense of its all of these de facto realities, and say, yes, I mean, you are great, you guys, I mean, you do this things. We don't recognize them. You know, just, you know, let it exist somewhere so that they feel, the Moscow politicians, they feel that at least they are understood. Something like that, and then you can talk. And that, of course, provided that they that Moscow doesn't go on any further adventures. That, of course, will break it all again. Not a good response, but it's a really complicated. The trust is the big issue.
I think we have time for one more question. That will be here.
My name is Dag Kloster. I'm also a pensioner, having studied Russia for a long time. I have a question following up on the last one, really, and it concerns the Russian power systems and especially the military. But I'm interested in what is the status now in the population of the military and military service? That has been rather complicated during the years.
It's a very good question. I am no military expert, but at least I know public polls, kind of the results of the public opinion polls. And they tell us that Russia's military is the most trusted institution in Russia right now. On par with the church, somewhere close. The institute, even in the institution of the presidency, Putin is higher than presidency, by the way, but the institution of the presidency, let alone parliament or things like media, it's all way down there. So military is, probably Syria was a factor, we could argue, I don't know, but clearly for the past year, apparently when people feel that they're losing, you know, they're losing orientation, they don't know what to rely on, and they kind of start to think, okay, but the military, they're not political. Military is just a force. It's something that projects strength, which people like. And it's kind of a good thing, right, to be a strong power. Again, talking about strong power. But I think so. This is the reason, and the military reform, by the way, is one of the successes of the Russian political system of the past 10 years after the Georgian War, when they realized that Russia's military was not up to its tasks and really lacked. Compared to even to the Georgian military, so Russia essentially was took the upper hand then, but mostly because of the size and the pressure, but not because of the equipment, let's say. And since then, Russia had a deep running military reform, rearmament, and large investment in the Russian military, and apparently it kind of worked, and it also boosted the status, and also now it feels better to serve in the military. Officers are better paid, so it's kind of a more prestigious job. So all of these factors are working in favor of the military. And also, I think, just to wrap up, I think it shows what the Russian people want. I mean, the average, the lots of them, all those outside of Moscow, they don't want things to be highly political. They don't want imperialist politics. But they do want a strong military, and realizing that Russia historically has been a kind of a separate thing all in itself, not very European, not very Asian, something in between. We don't know ourselves who we are in that sense. I mean, I'll be honest, I don't know. Like, theoretically, we are European culturally, but again, not really. So people, and this is something real, right? At least it's strong. Okay. Then have a good culture also. Also, traditionally proud of, we have Tolstoy, we have Dostoevsky, cool, we have great theater. So this is the kind of all these things are a matter of consensus, I think, between very, very different Russians, yeah. So I think it's a very good question, and I think it's actually promising. It's not a bad thing actually, because a bad thing is, I think, is when people in the majority things like, we are attacked from all sides, we want to conquer territory, we need more of that or of this. So you have this kind of sickness in the system. But this basically is a signal of something. It's rather a healthy signal, I think. It just tells us that people, yes, they understand what strength is, but they don't want it to be political, don't want it to be imperialist. And I think people want a strong nation in Russia, not a strong empire.
Words. This wraps up our Russia events this year. It's been a busy fall with many seminars and conferences, but please stay tuned. We will be back in January. Thank you to all of you who chose to spend this morning together with us here at NUPI. Thank you to our online audience, and not least, thank you, Max, for a great presentation and for patiently answering our questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.